Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Sunday's Indycar. My name is Gordon Ross, and we've got three topics really to talk about today.
The fact that there are so many Eastern European...
Sorry about that. The first topic is actually to do with this month and what's happening with the Irish question towards the end of this month. As you're probably aware, the 28th of June this year is the deadline set by the European Union for the United Kingdom to come up with a workable plan to make sure that there is no, what shall we say, no friction at the Irish border. In other words, no physical infrastructure to prevent the free flow of goods, services, people, and cash across the border between the north of Ireland and the south. Now, the question is, can the Tories actually come up with anything in time? They've already come up with a plan, in fact several plans, which have all been rejected out of hand by Michel Barnier, the chief negotiator for Europe. The most recent plan involved creating a 10-mile wide buffer zone between the north and the south, kind of like in Korea, where there's a buffer zone between the north and the south, across which nobody can move in Korea's case, but in the case of Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland, this is to be some kind of trading zone, a little bit like China has set up in some of its provinces in order to trade with the West. So it's a bit like the way the Chinese communist state trades with the capitalist West. In this case, it will be the British state trading with the European Union in the south. So we've got the Europeans occupying the southern part of Ireland, and we've got the British state occupying this tiny six-county area at the top. And the question is, can Britain come up with a solution to this intractable problem of how to get free movement of people and goods and services across the border on a daily basis without having to set up any kind of physical infrastructure? And at the moment, there isn't really a way of doing it. And to be honest with you, the fact that they've asked for another 3-year extension to even the whole idea of the backstop. Now, the backstop is the last possible resort if they don't come up with a plan. They want more time. They want another 3 years to try and think up a way of doing this. And frankly, if they can't think up of a way of doing this in 2 years, I don't think there's much chance, even in 3, of the British state coming up with anything that anybody could accept in either Northern Ireland or the South, or in Europe, or in the UK. So the question then is, what happens on the 28th when Britain comes back to the table with Barnier, puts down maybe some other idea, and Barnier says, no, I'm sorry, that's not good enough. Remember that, to clarify things a little bit, the Europeans have made a concession to Britain, and this is something which the BBC doesn't like to mention, but the European Union has already offered Northern Ireland the ability to stay in a customs union with the EU for up to 3 years while Brexit is going on, so that there won't be a border in Northern Ireland. And they've made this offer contingent on it only applying to Northern Ireland. It's a one-off, one take it or leave it offer from the EU for the Irish people. If they want it, they can have it. But the UK has to agree to it, because the UK is still trying to run Northern Ireland from a distance. So the question is, will the UK accept that or not? I think not, because Brexit from the very beginning has a series of red lines, and one of the red lines is that everyone in the 4 countries or the 4 parts of the United Kingdom, because Northern Ireland isn't even a country, but the 4 parts of the United Kingdom all Brexit together. They all have exactly the same trading relationship with Europe, and nobody gets any special favours. Remember that the Democratic Unionist Party said explicitly that Northern Ireland was to be treated in exactly the same way as the rest of the UK. Otherwise, they would withdraw their support for the Tory party, and that would cause the government to collapse. The EU has offered the people of Northern Ireland the chance to remain part of the European Union and be able to trade with it after Brexit. The question now is, will the people of Northern Ireland, who outnumber the DUP in this respect, now tell the DUP to sling their hook because they want to be in Europe, because they voted to remain in Europe, and the party that's supposedly representing them at Westminster doesn't want them to be in Europe? So there are all sorts of forces acting, strains within Northern Ireland at the moment. If no deal is reached on the 28th and Britain does not come up with a workable solution that the European Union can accept, then there won't be any transition deal. In other words, although the UK can probably move on to talking about a trade deal, there will not be any transition period going from being in the UK to being outside of the EU and into this new trading arrangement. There will be no smooth transition from one thing to the other. The European Union has already said that if Britain fails in its key precursor moves and to satisfy the issue of citizens of Europe living in the UK and of the border in Ireland not existing, if they don't come up with these solutions by the end of this month, then, sorry, just waving to a friend, then there will be no transition period, no 2-year period for us to get readjusted to the idea of being outside of Europe. So that's a key thing that I wanted to try and correct, because I think I gave the wrong impression. I gave the impression that they wouldn't be allowed to negotiate a trade agreement. That's not actually quite true, and I've been corrected, and I stand corrected on that. But the situation is, although Britain can move forwards to negotiate a trading agreement with the EU, they cannot get a transition period if they don't solve the Irish problem. So that's one thing. The other thing is now that it looks as if the independence referendum is being held in abeyance just now for very, very good reason, which is that now, when we know what's going on with Brexit on the 28th, we'll know if there's going to be a transition period. Now, that's one of the very critical pieces of information we need before we call any kind of independence vote, because if it's going to be a sudden Brexit, even if it's not the hardest Brexit without a trade deal, but even a sudden abrupt change from being in the UK and being in the EU to being outside of the EU and working with this new trade deal, that's if we get the trade deal, by the way, we then know that there's going to be a problem for the changeover. It's going to be too sudden, too ferocious. There's going to be problems created. There's going to be problems in the supply chain, in trucks, in shipping, in aircraft. Everything has got to suddenly change. So that's a problem, but we will know about it on the 28th. The other question is, will there actually be a trade agreement negotiated, even if Britain does go through and negotiates this, despite having failed manifestly to satisfy Europe about the problems with the Northern Irish border? If they are allowed to go ahead and try and negotiate a trade deal, what negotiating position do they have? Well, the answer is not much, because the Tories have already decided what they're not going to do. And what they're not going to do is, A, they're not going to allow immigration from Europe in the way that it's done at the moment. They're not going to allow the freedom of travel. They're not going to allow anybody to just come in and out. European citizens come and go into the UK all the time. They come in, they work, they pay taxes, sometimes they go home, sometimes they stay. Sometimes people from the UK go over to Europe and they stay there permanently, or they move back. That will all end. That's the first thing the Tories have said. That cannot happen in their version of Brexit. So that's one of the 4 freedoms. Already a red line, they won't do it. That's one of the rules of being in the European Union or trading with it, that you must allow freedom of movement of people, capital, goods and services. And if even one of those isn't satisfied, you cannot get a trade agreement with the EU. So the chances of the UK doing a trade deal where they can restrict or stop migration of Europeans into the UK is almost nil, because the Europeans have already said from the beginning, right at the start 2 years ago, and they've reiterated it all the way through the process, that if the British government will not move on this issue of immigration, there cannot be a free trade agreement. The best that the UK could probably get out of the European Union would be some kind of very narrowly agreed trading arrangement. It wouldn't be a free trade agreement, because it can't be, because Britain will not play by the rules, and if we don't play by the rules, we can't play the game. So we'd still be outside the EU looking in, we'd be exporting and importing, but we'd be paying tariffs. There might not be World Trade Organization tariffs. The European Union might negotiate a slightly lower tariff for the UK, but it's still going to be taxed. And if they do that, then it's critical that everywhere in the UK has a hard border around it, because then those tariffs will apply in Northern Ireland as well. So that brings the whole problem back to Northern Ireland again, and it means chaos in all the ports around the UK. So this unsolvable problem is basically, we're stuck with it. No matter what the Tories do, they are dressing this thing up in all kinds of strange ways, but the basic core of it is rotten. It can't work. If you Brexit fully and completely and you don't allow people free movement in and out of Europe, then flights to Europe would have to stop, ships to Europe would have to stop, the movement of people to and from universities would have to stop, research and development would have to stop, all sorts of things would have to stop. Medicines, medical research, where people are coming and going all the time. The NHS has a large proportion of its staff come from Europe. That would stop. Those Europeans would be evicted under these new regulations that the hard Brexiters want to install. We would end up with this British-only NHS, which is going to be denuded and depleted of even more doctors, nurses and specialist staff. It can't work. In my own opinion, and this is just my opinion, when I looked at this, I think that when it comes to the crunch, and I mean the 29th of March next year, when the British government has to decide what it's going to do, whether it's going to proceed with this stupid, crazy notion of Brexit as they have got it at the moment, unplanned, without any idea of how they're going to do it, or simply saying to the British people, we're going to abandon Brexit, it's going to do too much damage to the economy and too much damage to everybody in Europe, in Ireland and everywhere else, and it will destroy the integrity of the United Kingdom. We must abandon it and stop. The worst thing that could happen to the Tories in that case would be a backlash from their own right wing, maybe a bit of civil unrest on the streets, and they would lose, and there would be another election and they would lose it to Corbyn. But that's the worst thing that would happen to the Tories. They probably wouldn't be too much upset by that or even hurt by it in terms of finances. They will have squirreled all their money away in their nice little tax haven island somewhere or other, and they'll be sitting pretty while the chaos begins. And they will leave the poison chalice to Corbyn to pick up and sip from there on. And he, as you know, is a committed Eurosceptic. He doesn't like being in the European Union, despite the fact that his party wants us to remain in the customs union and the free trade area. So we then would end up with a situation where Labour was left holding this hot potato of Brexit and not knowing what to do with it. That, to me, is, I think, the most likely thing that the Tories will do. They're not going to stick around and take the blame for the mess they've created. That's not in their DNA to do so. Their DNA is to try and spread the blame across Europe. The Labour Party, the SNP, Plaid Cymru, anybody else who doesn't agree with Tories will be blamed for them pulling out of Brexit. They'll say, well, everybody in these other parties is being nasty and saying that it's not going to work, so we're just going to abandon it and blame them. That is actually, I think, a very tempting thing for the Tories to do, maybe in March. And so I'm worried, not so much about Brexit happening, but I'm more worried about what happens if the Tories decide to abandon it and risk political oblivion rather than political chaos across the entire country that a hard Brexit will produce. In the meantime, the SNP are having to keep quiet about Indyref because at the moment there are some key facts that we need to know. We need to know, first of all, is there going to be a transition period? And the end of this month will tell us that. So if they don't come up with a viable plan for Ireland by the 28th of this month, then there will be no transition period no matter what the Brexit deal is. So that would be one fact that the SNP would know, and that means more likely that we will win our independence. The second one is, are the Tories actually going to commit to Brexit? And we will know that by the end of October. According to the Tories themselves, they plan to unveil their white paper on how Brexit will happen and what our trade stance will be with the European Union. In broad brushstrokes, they will tell us what they're going to try and negotiate with Europe. And by that time, we will know exactly what the Tory government has in store for us. They're going to try and dress it up and paint a pretty picture of it and wave lots of Union Jacks and wrap everything in Union Jacks. But the bottom line is we'll know by October. If we know by October and it's looking so bad that either abandoning Brexit or going through with it are both likely to be a disaster, then I think the independence referendum will be called at that point in October once those facts are known. That leaves, believe it or not, just a shade under 5 months until the 29th of March, during which time we need to hold that referendum. It will probably be in March, I think, next year, because that's as late as you can leave it. In brinkmanship, you have to go right up to the wire, and the Tories are going to take this right up to the wire. They might not even decide in October that they want to have Brexit. They might not reveal their white paper until March or something like that. But we can't really wait any longer. We have approximately, I think there's a mandatory window of 16 weeks needed for any referendum on anything of national importance like independence. So to have that referendum, we need 16 weeks at least prior to the date of Brexit. So it's got to be 4 months before the 29th of March that this independence referendum is called, at least, so that we have enough time to do it and the vote happens before the Brexit date. It has to precede it. Otherwise, the 111 powers that we're going to be losing to Westminster will disappear, and they will be used to silence the devolved parliaments, to even perhaps disband them or suspend them during Brexit. We don't know what the Tories will do. So I think we now know what the timetable looks like. At the end of this month, we'll know if there's going to be any kind of transition. By October, we'll know approximately how bad the Tories' plan is for Brexit, and if we can live with that or not. I suspect probably not. Generally speaking, everybody's agreed that Brexit's going to be bad. We'll find out how bad in October, and then we need to hold our referendum once it's clear. But it needs to be before March the 29th, and I would say a good few weeks before March the 29th, so that we have a chance to then talk to the EU before the 29th. In other words, so that the Scots can declare their independence, have it recognised by Europe and the UN before the 29th of March. It's very, very fine timing. We're talking about a time window of just a month, 28 days, in which to save Scotland from being dragged into a useless, pointless self-destruction that Brexit is going to be. Remember, the Americans are now shutting the door in our faces as well. They're slapping tariffs on British goods that are going into the United States. They're putting trade barriers up all over the place. The European Union is having to respond. There's a trade war coming. And actually, probably the best place to be is to be independent as a part of Europe, maybe not actually inside Europe, but certainly relating to it in a good way, and possibly with trade ties now to Russia, which has an economy which is growing, which is closer to us and is a ready market for our exports. And don't forget that other parts of Europe are in trouble as well, notably Spain is in trouble. The Catalans, I think, will get their independence eventually. And I think Gibraltar is going to be a huge problem for the British as well. So it's all kinds of trouble ahead. And Scotland will be in a far better position to do something about it if we're outside the British state by the time Brexit happens, so that we have enough time to talk to the Europeans and say, look, we've voted yes, we're seceding from the UK. Now, put us in the holding pattern so that we can choose either to remain in the EU as we are, but with new terms, or develop a new free trade agreement with you. But we're not going down with the British ship. That's really it. That's the timescale as it works out. In my mind anyway, other people may want to correct me here, but I think it boils down to the month of March as being the cut-off point. We have to have a referendum in that period, because that's probably the only time we'll be able to do it with any kind of certainty about what's going to happen with Brexit. Anyway, I'm off. Have a good day, folks. I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye for now.